And welcome back. Florida Rising is making a significant impact across the state of Florida by building independent political power for historically marginalized communities. They're dedicated to expanding democracy, ensuring climate and housing justice, fighting for gender and reproductive rights, and reforming the criminal justice system. Joining us is the Chief Political Advocacy Officer of Florida Rising, Moné Holder. And Moné, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Darren.
You know, there's so many people out there who say, listen, when it comes to Florida and marginalized communities and people of color, we already know the story. We know that there's a lot of challenges out there, and really the opportunity to, is present for people to really come together and try to really defeat some of the things that are going on in the state of Florida. And for yourself, Florida Rising, how do you find the atmosphere and the awareness of Floridians when it comes to this particular matter?
Well, Floridians in general, we have seen many attacks on our Black and Brown communities as it relates to various issues from criminal systems reform to our education, banning books, and stripping our access to the real history of slavery and Black folks. But we're continuously seeing attacks as it relates to voter suppression. And as we approach our primary election, which is on August 20th, and of course the November elections, we're seeing more and more attacks and efforts to deter us from the ballot box. But people are energized. They know that their vote is their voice. And I think they're really going to take this opportunity to show strength in numbers and power during this election cycle.
Can you give us, our viewers, a little bit more of a, inside look when we talk about voters being denied the opportunity to really take it to the ballot box? What kind of challenges are Floridians facing, particularly marginalized communities?
Sure. So it's been, progressively happening over the last couple of years during our legislative session and also through some of the tactics from our governor, Ron DeSantis. But to name a few, just even dating back, returning citizens do not have their automatic rights restoration, meaning after they serve time, they weren't automatically having their right to vote restored. We did a huge effort, Florida Rights Restoration Coalition and many others, to restore the right to over 1.4 million returning citizens. And then our legislature tried to strip that back from us by requiring fines and fees to be paid, essentially disenfranchising voters. We've had changes to third-party voter registration groups, such as Florida Rising, making it harder for us to register people to vote in Black and Brown communities. We've also seen more restrictions as it relates to vote by mail and early voting locations, information not being distributed equitably, especially in communities that don't speak English as their first language. And we've also just seen various scare tactics and misinformation and disinformation in our communities that we had been seeing before but are at an all-time high. So now, even this week with our primary elections coming up and early voting was supposed to commence on this Monday, we were hit by a storm. We're pushing to have an extension of some time to make sure that voters have access to the ballot box because we know early voting is really important leading up to Election Day.
Yeah, and I know that, Floridians have just been going through it, and we talk about the state of democracy in Florida, a lot of rights being challenged, attempted rollbacks of a lot of different things. It could be something that can wear somebody down. What's been the attitude and what's been the mindset in trying to keep people motivated, particularly at a tough time such as this?
Well, voter apathy is definitely a real thing. We do have some folks in community who don't necessarily want to fight through the challenges of voting or may not make the connection to their daily lives, but that's where we come in. So we're having conversations with people year round on how to connect the dots between elections, who represents you, and your quality of life. I think more recently, with a lot of the attacks coming down from our state government and people being aware of how that impacts them, as well as people being energized about the top of the ticket and Vice President Kamala Harris vying for the seat of president, people are energized. They are looking to make a difference. They're looking to make history, but they're really, really understanding the impact of elections and what it means to have someone who represents you being in office.
Since the vice president is now the Democratic nominee, What has been the mood of Floridians around this, particularly the ones that you've engaged with? Has there been more of a, okay, we've got to get ourselves registered to vote. We got to get out to the polls. What are you seeing with boots on the ground from Floridians with the candidacy now of the Democratic candidacy of Kamala Harris?
There's a lot of energy. We've seen an increase in folks who are joining us for our volunteer efforts, whether it's knocking on doors, making phone calls, or sending text messages. People wanting to know, like, how do I be down? We have to win this thing. People who may or may not have had a connection to Joe Biden when he was on the campaign trail for the reelection definitely feel a deeper connection and have a sense of hope and change now that Vice President Kamala Harris will be on or is projected to be on the ticket. So people really are excited, they're energized, especially younger voters and people who just simply were thinking about sitting this one out because they didn't have quite the connection. So like I said, we have seen people organize themselves, whether it's the Win with Black Women calls and all of the people in Florida who jumped on there, to people joining organizations like Florida Rising, wanting to know how can they volunteer their time and how can they spread the message to their communities about voting.
Let me talk a little bit from another perspective. Let me talk a little bit about climate change. I mean, it's huge. A lot of people are really coming to the reality that climate change is real. We're seeing a lot of different things as far as the weather's concerned. What has been Florida Rising's perspective on climate change and really making the awareness pitch to the public?
Yes, so in we've been taking it from many different angles. Definitely advocacy on the federal level and in the state level, looking towards more clean energy and zero waste. But on the local level is where we've been having a lot of traction and engaging in a lot of fights amongst different incinerator projects that are slated to be popped up, of course, in communities of color that we know pollute our air and lead to long-term effects in health disparities in our communities, as well as the attack as it relates to energy companies and how they're not only surcharging in a surge of increase in charges to Black and Brown communities, but the long-term effects on not using clean energy. So those are the fights that we've been having on the local level as well as the state level, and really trying to educate people. Like you said, that climate change affects us in our daily lives. The impact that we've just had in the storms that hit Florida during hurricane season, and outside of that, the weather, the increase in the temperature, coupled with us not having a lot of protections for workers in the sun, all of these things impact their lives. So I would say the climate change arena or ecosystem is growing. More and more people in community are paying attention and wanting to be aware, attending meetings with us, but it's definitely an important fight and one that's detrimental to our livelihood and survival here in Florida.
How would you describe the state of housing within Florida?
We're in a crisis. One definitely say as a tagline, number one, the rent is too damn high. That's part of it. And in addition to the rising cost of housing and the shift of what affordable housing actually means and how it's accessible to Black and Brown communities has been devastating to us. The increase in homelessness and the lack of housing and options for people who are unhoused, as well as dealing with slumlords who don't upkeep and maintain the properties that people can actually afford, which leads to, health impacts and other things. So we're attacking housing in many different angles, but the moral of the story is the rent is too damn high. We need rent control, we need rent stabilization, and we definitely need livable conditions from landlords and those who are providing shelter and housing for people in our communities.
You talk about rent, but obviously home ownership is also critical as well. There's so many people who cannot own a home simply because of the economy and what's going on. I was reading an article just the other day, and it said that in the state of Florida, average home prices run around $443,000 a year. Give us some boots on the ground perspective as to the home ownership crisis.
It's precisely that. It's not accessible. It's not affordable for many people. In addition to the increase in insurance, Well, we've also seen a spike in, even with new subdivisions or developments that are coming up across the state, a large number of those homes or properties being bought by developers and then rented out for astronomical costs. So people are moving into the phase of having more and more roommates or just simply being unhoused. So being able to purchase is not something that is attainable for a lot of folks in our communities, and it's really, really sad.
Yeah. I want to switch fronts for a little bit, talk about the work that you're doing with gender and reproductive justice. A lot of work that's being done. We know the Supreme Court has made its decision. Uh, Local and state government still haggling some things out. But while the haggle is going on, the work is still going on from the part of Florida Rising.
Yes. So unfortunately, Florida enacted and passed and enacted a 6-week abortion ban. So that's where we are now in the state. But Florida Rising is one of the leading groups in the coalition called Floridians Protecting Freedom, which is the campaign leading an abortion access ballot initiative. It would be Amendment 4, and it will be on the ballot in November. And what it will do is bring the choice in the autonomy to make decisions about your health care back into individuals, back into women, not into the hands of politicians. It's a private decision between a woman and her healthcare provider and her family, and not one that should be decided by government. So Amendment 4 will be on the ballot. We are extremely excited about it. It's been a, a, a process in the making, but we reached the threshold of getting signatures collected. We have a lot of support and energy from the community here locally, but we've received a lot of support across the nation within this campaign. And we know that in November, we will reach the 60% threshold to have it passed and have abortion access enshrined in the Constitution here in Florida.
Yeah, I think for some people the question is whether or not the bear has actually been poked when it comes to this matter. Going to the polls, we'll talk about it in November. How big of an issue is going to be gender and reproductive justice in terms of communities of color actually coming out to the polls from your perspective?
It's huge. I mean, I think it's a couple things. If and when you have someone who may not be connected to candidates or interested in who they're voting for on the ballot, they definitely have an interest in an issue. And the issue of abortion access transcends across race, gender, political party, and class. We have found that this is indeed a bipartisan issue, and people definitely want to have the right to make their own decisions. So it will be something that people turn out to vote for. It will be a motivating factor for people to have a decision on how they're able to govern themselves. I mean, in addition to Amendment 4, we also have Amendment 3, which will be on the ballot regarding legalizing recreational marijuana. So I think outside of top of the ticket and the down ballot races that we have in Florida, we have two very, very important issues with abortion and marijuana legalization that will definitely energize and turn people out to vote.
And we talk about another issue too, which is criminal justice reform. And obviously, in my last couple of segments, we were talking a little bit about criminal justice reform, the fact of those incarcerated and the things that need to be done. How do we see this playing out in Florida? And talk to me about the work of Florida Rising in dealing with criminal justice reform.
So yes, so I think in criminal justice reform and where folks stand on definitely police accountability and community policing and restorative justice are topics that come up often in our people's assemblies that we have monthly with our members, as well as when we're looking to candidates that we endorse and think would be the right fit to support our community. So we're definitely not only where folks are at, but pushing them in a way in which it's restorative justice. It's a way to bring whole the community and not just being a highly penal system. We've looked at it from a lens of returning citizens, so those who have felony convictions and continue to be criminalized in their daily lives, whether it be through voting or other actions, and looking for ways to be proactive and bring more resources into community instead of pouring additional resources into law enforcement that doesn't necessarily bring forth the change that people want to see. So we're looking at it both on the local level, starting with, our sheriff's races and what relationships and accountability we can hold there, and then what the state and federal government, what kind of actions that they can take in order to support criminal systems reform overall that trickles down into the state.
Yeah. And for yourself, what do you find to be the biggest issue right now that maybe people aren't talking about in Florida that we up here in New York, across the Northeast, could probably be paying attention to?
So I'll say, unfortunately, but fortunately, with Florida, all of our issues are on the forefront. But I definitely think with a governor who has positioned himself and is trying to position his party to strip away um, the history of Black folks in slavery from our school system and ban books and continually suppress voters of color is something that we definitely need to continue to pay attention to. And not only as we hopefully see Governor DeSantis on his way out totally in the state, but the groundwork that may have been laid for administrations to come. How do we reel back and gain what we've lost, and also continue to make progress in all of those aspects, especially as it relates to education?
Yeah. You know, we up here in New York always have that conversation with Florida about this is the state that a lot of people are vacating New York to go to. They're going to Florida. But the question is, when it comes to communities of color, are we seeing the same kind of traction that actually is being reported?
I think it depends. Um, yes, Florida is a state to retire to and call home, but it actually depends on, who you are and your social economic status. For some people, it's still a great retirement space. If for some folks who are coming to start a family, I think you have to be mindful of what's at play here. And then there's also the locally where you choose to live in Florida. Florida is a huge state. We have 67 counties, many different municipalities here. So there are some great places where you can anchor yourself, become involved, make change, and live quality of life. But there's a lot of places in which you can't. So I think people definitely have to do their research and define their why when they think about relocating to a place such as Florida.
Yeah, Moné, I got to leave it there, but I want to thank you for joining us and sharing a little bit about what's going on with Florida Rising. I mean, as we get closer to November, we're going to need you, so you're going to have to come on back and share with us so that way we can get the inside scoop and find out what's going on and what we can do to assist in spreading the word to get the message out. So thanks so much for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All righty.